I think that Orion Pax and Optimus are a lot more differentiated than you give it credit for. I think if I had to guess where you're getting this from, is that Megatron, D16 to Megatron is just more palpable. The difference from going to a friendly to an evil person is just a way bigger contrast from going to
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have on back with us an original guest to the podcast, Nicholas O'Donnell, to review a epitomized classic in the cinematic universe of all films, something that has been lauded as originally one of the worst series to come out, has come back with a new origin story. That's right. We are reviewing Transformers 1, released in September 20th of 2024, so just a few days ago. This was one that was, it's brand new, so we're looking into it. I threw myself off right there, but it doesn't matter because right now we're talking about our overall impressions of this film. So, Nicholas, what was your thoughts after watching this for the first time?
Hi. So I liked it a lot. It's not a perfect movie. Wouldn't go that far. But is any movie really perfect? If you're analyzing the enjoyability of this, it's a really good movie for Transformers fans, and arguably, I don't even know if it's arguably, it's almost just definitively the best Transformers movie that we've gotten, which is not necessarily a high bar if you're considering Michael Bay films. I'm just saying it's far and above the best movie, and I hope that this is the first of a series.
Nice. Well, hopefully what we've seen from the box office so far is not an indication of where they'll go in regards to making a second. But
yeah, people are going to see this episode, and then that's going to completely save it. So there's a lot riding on this podcast episode today.
Definitely not. But what is?
Don't worry, I'll bring the people.
Nice, appreciate that. So overall thoughts of that is it's definitely, as a reboot, brings a lot of fresh things to the Transformers franchise that we haven't seen before, right? Especially the ideas of Cybertron and even just the topography of the planet and how the planet interacted was very unique from a world building perspective. I appreciated that a lot. I thought it was very interesting in regards to that aspect. The film itself had some really interesting things they did as well. I'm sure a lot of head nods for people who are big fans of the Transformers franchise as a whole. But beyond that, a storyline that definitely isn't perfect, but had some really surprising elements that I appreciated that they brought in. So
that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah. But for people who are interested in watching the film or haven't watched the film but want to know what we're even talking about, Nicholas, what is Transformers 1 about?
So I would say this movie is in many ways a love letter to Transformers fans in many forms of Transformers media that have come out over the years, like comics or TV shows. Optimus Prime and Megatron refer to each other as having been brothers once, and we haven't actually seen that in any form of live action Transformers media. I guess this isn't technically live action, but any form of like animated, whether it be TV show or movie. And they finally addressed that. They finally said, we're going to make a movie. We're going to make it entirely on Cybertron. We're not going to clutter this with any human characters. We're going to go back to where it all started. And so Transformers 1 provides a loose but creative reimagining of some of Transformers' more notable characters and their unplanned mission to thwart the corruption that has quietly been taking over their home planet Cybertron.
Nice. That's a good summary. So, and especially because you're right, most people do have some background of Megatron versus Optimus Prime, right? The atypical war between the two is a icon in the whole Transformers franchise.
An icon, even, if you will.
Okay. funny. So,
It's hilarious.
anyways,
That's the kind of humor that we got out of this movie.
oh my gosh, yeah, seriously. It was So that's definitely true.
I figured you'd appreciate that.
So, based on the 9-point rating system, what we use to review films on this podcast, Nicholas, what did you get for Transformers 1?
It's entirely mathematical, so I don't know why I was surprised at the end of it to see what I actually got. I got a 7.25. Also, when did we get into like the quarter decimal rankings in this system? It's become so convoluted since I've been on last time, man. What are you doing? I got a 7.25, which I mean, in my mind, I held it to a higher bar, but apparently it boils out according to whatever ranking system you got. That I got a 7.25.
Sure, and if you wanted to see a breakdown of that, we definitely could get that for you. A lot of the emphasis is put on establishing key both characters and their motives, especially for the protagonist. A lot of value is placed upon the opposing force, and then building up the tension in the film. So those three key components make up a bulk of the rating system as a whole, probably a good 6 or 7 points of it. And then the remaining bit is basically other things that are important, but not necessarily critical to making a compelling film. So are you drawn out of the film because the setting isn't good? Does it have a good plot twist and those kinds of things? So those
it took me a half an hour to fill it out, man.
Well, I mean, you don't have to leave notes. You can just click.
Wait, what?
Done in 5.
Oh, dang. Why didn't you tell me that before I left all those notes?
Yeah, so that's what we use. If you want to see a full breakdown of how that works, check out the 9-point rating system breakdown episode where we go into that in depth. But that's not what this is about. What this is about is Transformers 1. So, I'm sorry, you said you got a 7.25?
Yes. Sweet. That is exactly what I got.
Nice. I got a 4.35. So,
wow.
We got the spread today, and we're going to check it out, see what happened.
I'm a little confused.
Did
we watch the same movie?
Not the first time.
Was there another Transformers 1?
Yeah, so I'm excited. Let's get into it. The opening scene introduces you to this character who is known as Orion Pax. For you who are listening and have not watched the film, he is the precursor to Optimus Prime, his original name, and he's exploring these archives trying to find this information in regards to historical... what was the thing called that they were chasing in this film?
The not the Allspark. That's where my mind first went. It's that would be going too far back. No, it's the Matrix of Leadership. The Matrix of Leadership is key to getting the energon flowing on Cybertron again, and it's been lost. The last time somebody tried to find it, it disappeared. It went to the core of Cybertron, as it turns out. Again, spoiler. And it took somebody pretty special to be able to retrieve it. So Orion Pax was in the archives looking for any clues, any Cybertronian history that hadn't been hidden or destroyed that might reveal where that Matrix of Leadership is so that he can be the one to find it.
Yeah.
Basically, Cybertronian Indiana Jones.
Yep.
He's just looking for that treasure.
Absolutely. He's it's in regards to an opener, they also use it to demonstrate the world and everything that's happened. Just so you know, you as the audience, here is Cybertron, here are these great warriors that all disappeared, here's this only one left, blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. That's what you get, right? So
it's a little bit of filling you in on bringing you up to speed on what's going on in the world.
Right. It was definitely so it felt very stereotypical, but it wasn't bad, right? It was fine. It was definitely establishing the character, showing, okay, this is what we're looking for. And there wasn't a bad motive for Orion Pax to be there, right? Orion Pax was there because he was looking for information on this treasure. And mm-hmm. He didn't find what he was looking for, which was unfortunate for him, but he was desperately searching for an answer to his questions. So it was appropriate for sure.
Orion Pax, at least in this establishing of the story, is there like a rebel with a cause, as I like to call it, where he is a bit of a troublemaker. He's willing to bend some rules, but he's
Right.
doing it with a good intent. He ultimately, at his core, has always been a good bot. And so, even though he hasn't always been the biggest or the strongest, in this sense, he was doing it with the intent to help because he knew that his planet depended on it, and he wasn't content with the way that things are. There's been a bit of a slip in how Cybertron used to be versus what it's fallen to after some of the events you learn about a little bit later in the movie. What happened with Primus and the Primes and their ultimate downfall. And there's just a question being left in the minds of all of these still living Cybertronians as to what happened 60 years ago. Why has the energon stopped flowing? Where has the planet's life sustaining force gone to? And some of them have just gotten along with it. They've taken on jobs as miners to be able to just get by and provide for the planet on a day-to-day basis. So then there's people like Orion Pax, where in his off time, he's going to go break some rules to try to get to the bottom of this and make things how they used to be, get some answers.
Yeah, and so that's what you get in the film, and that's really the origin for Orion Pax. Did you think that his motive as a character was compelling, and especially his flaws as a character? Did you think that he had reasons for you to empathize with him and opportunities for growth?
Sure, I think that he's not the same character as Optimus Prime. In many forms of media, when there even is reference to Orion Pax, it's typically because he was a librarian of sorts that worked at the archives. In this reimagining, he doesn't work there. I don't suspect that he ever did, unless that happened even before the intro of this movie. But he does have good motives, I think. I kind of like what I just laid out. He cares about doing what's best for Cybertron and providing for people. And he's not content with working in the mines effectively as a slave. He wants what's best for himself and his friends and the planet. And he is convinced that he has to crack a few eggs, even if that means putting his own life on the line to be able to make that effective change. And so they imply that him breaking into the archives was not the first time this has happened. So how many times it's happened, we don't quite know. But he clearly has a burning passion to get to the bottom of what's going on and get some answers. And he's willing to make some sacrifices for it, as we find out just the degree of sacrifice that he's willing to make for his friends.
Right. Yeah, he's definitely very driven as a character, right? Which is great. I think his motive um I think there's some degree of right, he's just an adventurer going out trying to find the adventure for the future, at least in this film. But there's also another aspect in which, especially searching through the archives, there's some indication that he is on a search for truth, right? And he's
Mhm.
trying to find where the truth is because he knows there's something not quite right about the narrative being told to him currently. Unfortunately, I think that aspect of the film motives is only hinted at in this, and there isn't really developed a ton. So it's somewhat there, but not fully developed. But I appreciated that it was at least indicated. I think a
Well,
lot more of the motive and development is more on the side of D16 than
mhm.
Orion Pax's character. So the effort there is a little, in my opinion, lackluster for Orion Pax compared to D16, who turns into Megatron. But it definitely was at least there was some development, especially on the adventuring side of Orion Pax.
Well, there is a distinction to be made. It's not that
Mhm.
Orion Pax is suspect that there's some kind of conspiracy afoot. It's that he thinks that there's been something that's lost to history, and nobody else sees eye to eye with him with the importance of learning what that history is and what that can lead to in the restoration of Cybertron. And
Right.
so D16, in contrast, he I mean, he even makes a reference, which at that point was a joke, but that was the first element of foreshadowing that immediately told me what the deal was going to be with Sentinel. And so D16 is like, we need like good elected representatives, and Sentinel's the best because he looks out for us, right? That's what everybody thought. Nobody was suspect of the government. they all believed that the government was trying to find the solution as well, and Orion Pax wanted to help in that effort. He was just because he was the grunt, right? He was sentenced to the mines. He was doing manual labor by force, but he felt that he had something greater to contribute, which is why, in an unofficial capacity, he was willing to take matters into his own hands. But none of it was out of a distrust of government. That came later. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
There was at least some indication that there was some distrust of government. Partially, one, because he's not fully surprised, it seems like D16 is, when the revelation occurs. But second off, he's breaking into secured archives of the government to find out what was going on. So at the very least, he thought that something was being kept from the people. And I'm not going to like dwell too much on that because, like I said before, it's not a huge section of the film. But I think that there's definitely something to be said for. All my point was that I think that was an interesting side aspect to Orion Pax when he's first introduced, and it isn't really explored later on in the film. And so I think they could have. And one of my critiques of this film is somewhat around Orion Pax, but my big critique of him is that he had some very interesting things they could have done with him that they didn't do. And this is one of those examples where it's like beyond just being this altruistic, let's do the right thing and help the people, there is this idea of I'm fighting for something greater, and that is an idea of truth that was indicated this little seed of a thought of why is something being kept from us in the archives. So anyways, that's all I had to say on that specific point. But yeah, he gets involved in the conflict pretty early on when first they get into the race, and then they go on this whole, it's kind of a weird meandering thing because they go into the race and they fall down into the trash dump, and then they go out into the surface, and like it's somewhat of an adventure, but the adventure definitely pivots about a third of the way through the film when they realize they've been lied to. Maybe a little bit further than a third of the film, but thereabouts. What was your thoughts on that revelation that they come to where spoiler alert, Sentinel Prime's a bad guy?
Sentinel's always been a bit of a troubled character in most iterations of Transformers media, whether that's just being somebody who's a pompous blowhard but ultimately still is on the side of good, all the way to being somebody who is willing to be a turncoat and betray the Autobots for the sake of what he thinks is right. He's kind of a lone character in that regard, where he doesn't necessarily fall on the side of the Decepticons or the Autobots. He just has his own thought of what he needs to do and is willing to do that. This, I've never quite seen Sentinel taken to this degree of not just willing to betray his own kind, but willing to kill them at his own hand. That was one of the darker elements of this particular story that I was actually surprised and pleased to see happen, because he does ultimately get his. And if they hadn't demonstrated just how cutthroat Sentinel was, then that might have felt a little undeserved. But by the time they got to that point where D16 has his chance, they wanted to make sure that everybody had the human distaste for Sentinel. And so, going back to your initial question, it's not unprecedented to see Sentinel be in like an anti-hero. I guess really, like, he wasn't even a hero in this. He was just a secret villain. But anywhere in that gray scale of an Autobot that's just got some trouble to somebody who is effectively a Decepticon just for a different cause. And I wasn't surprised. No. I to some degree, I saw it coming. They put him on such a pedestal that it was almost impossible to not see that pedestal was a sham.
Right. And like
that being said, it is a kid's movie. So I should say a movie that was made so that it can be acceptable for kids. And so there is some line to be drawn between making a story so nuanced and convoluted that a lot of it goes over the mind of what could be, a large portion of the audience.
Right.
But then also making something deep enough that it can be appreciated by adults, especially Transformers fans who can appreciate a lot of these nuanced references. So it's a definite fence to be straddled. And I'm not saying they did it perfect, but I also appreciate how difficult of a job that can be to write a story like this and then actually pull it off.
Sure. Well, and I think that they do well, just as a side, on some of those things where they have people, for example, they execute one guy, I forget who it was, but they go to cut off his head, right? But they don't show you as the audience that actually happening. So they tried to keep it PG for the
That
kids.
was one of the primes that happened to bear the Decepticon emblem as his faceplate.
Mm-hmm.
That was the
Megatronus Prime.
Yeah, good memory.
Yes. Well, I mean, he says it only 20 million times in the movie.
Well, he is the coolest, so.
Yeah. But, no, that was definitely... yeah, in regards to Sentinel Prime, I don't know that his turncoat aspect was surprising that happened. The explanation was very interesting, I thought.
Mm-hmm. No, I thought it worked.
Yeah, because it and that was maybe the most nuanced aspect of him as a character, in my opinion, was that Sentinel Prime made a deal with the devil, proverbially, that he was going to become the ruler of this universe, subject to them, paying them tribute in return for eliminating all the competition, right? And in the process of doing that, he thought that he could just take the matrix of leadership and continue on what had happened before. Turns out that's not how the matrix of leadership works, and now he's in a bind where now he no longer has the matrix of leadership. The power of the universe is no longer flowing, and he still has this debt to pay. So now he enslaves all these people to become his workers to gain the money he needs to pay off the alien race that helped him to get into power.
The Quintessons, which,
Yes.
If you can't do the time, don't do the crime.
Basically. Yeah.
He did it all.
And I don't know anything about the Quintessons, to be perfectly honest, but it was interesting to have them just thrown in, and definitely if they were to do a sequel, it would be interesting to see more of them in the universe.
Here's my hypothesis. The Quintessons are a nuanced character, more so than I'll get into in the length of one podcast, but they've never been portrayed in this capacity before, of being some alternate race that is such a powerhouse that they could effectively control the Cybertronian government. At least not in any medium that I've ever seen. But they were such an afterthought, or so it could have come across as being an afterthought, because of just the sheer limited amount of time that they are in the movie. But I do think that I in fact I've read about this. There are plans for this movie to become a trilogy. I hope it does, because it won't seem like such an afterthought if the Quintessons get their chance to become the primary enemy. So Sentinel was not even the main bad guy. He was a catalyst for a lot to happen. Sentinel was a catalyst to introduce the Quintessons, so that later on in future movies they could take their role as being the big bad. He was a catalyst for D16 to become Megatron.
Right.
And then he was kind of his own little mini villain arc in the middle of all that. So I'm not surprised that they went the direction they did with Sentinel, and I think that it served a lot of purposes, both in this movie and setting it up. If this was the only movie they ever ended up planning on making, I would say it's a letdown. But I also don't think that a movie like this is to be taken solely in its entirety. I think it's to be taken as, for example, if you were to evaluate Into the Spider-Verse, it's a good movie, and it stands on its own. But it also leaves a lot open for a greater character, greater story arc. It wasn't written just to be self-contained. And so there's that dilemma when you're trying to make movies that have several parts where each story can be satisfying in its own regard and it can tell the story that it's trying to tell, but then also kind of leave on that future possibility to be able to be something greater than its individual constituents. And this is one of those cases where everything that I've evaluated from the movie, everything that I've read about, where the creators of this movie want to take this moving forward, it does line up that this movie is not to be taken entirely on its own. Again,
Sure.
not saying that it shouldn't be judged on its own, but I'm saying don't only take it as that it's supposed to be judged on its own, because I do think that there's some greater story to be told here. Why would they go all to this length of establishing a compelling character like Megatron just to drop it? I think that the only way we don't see sequels to this movie are if it bombs in the box office.
I mean,
and that would be for reasons other than because of what the story was made to do.
Right,
that's just a real world kind of roadblock.
You're definitely not.
I'm not wrong. Thank you.
To say that a movie that's part of a series can bleed into later films and make the sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And so there's definitely that aspect to it, that if they take this on, it could lead to greater things. But I see this kind of like I saw Batman Begins, which we just reviewed on this podcast. One of the things about that is that film, of all of the 3 Christopher Nolan Batman films, is the least memorable, right? And it's the first one. In a lot of ways, they are setting everything up for the ones afterwards. There's almost a sense in which there's too much setup in the first one, just hoping for the next one to actually
just really trying to
out.
Cram in as much as they can.
Right. And that can be a problem where you can't even get the series off the ground if the first one doesn't have enough merit in and of itself. Now,
you weight it down too much.
Yeah, exactly. I think the first Batman Begins does decent enough at straddling that line, but it's close, right? It's not. It is its own story, but it could have very easily not have been. It could have just been the prequel addendum to the next film. So yeah. That being said, The Dark Knight totally capitalizes off of that. Does well. You will see that soon in an upcoming episode. We're not going to talk about that right now, but going back to this one, if they're trying to do the same thing, right, with Transformers 1 and have Transformers 2 or whatever they're going to call the next one, this one I could see being in a very similar boat where you go, okay, some things that aren't ideal about this one, it could have been a lot better, but if they do very well with the second one, it could make up for some of the failings of the first one, and you could see it as okay, this was a pretty decent story as a whole. Right.
I'm not a professional story writer by any means. You won't see my name up on the big screen. But as a Transformers fan, I feel like I'm more qualified to critique these movies than I am most movies, just because I'm looking for something specific when I'm watching these TV shows, if I'm reading these comics, if I'm watching these movies. And the direction that I would have taken wouldn't have been a drastic change, but it would have been more in the direction of making a compelling, self-contained movie that towards the end of the movie leaves the door open for something more, but doesn't necessarily leave you like wanting more out of necessity. If a new movie never came out, that movie should be able to stand on its own 2 feet. That's kind of the crux that I come back to, is if something that happens in the real world, you don't get the funding for it, there's not the demand for it, that movie should still be a good movie that doesn't need anything else to be good. What this did is it was kind of like dropping hints of what could come in the future throughout it, which means if a new movie didn't come out, those are going to seem like little question marks just left throughout it, like loose threads that never get cut, they never get used.
Right.
And so that's more what I would have changed, is maybe I would have found a way to reference the Quintessons or give them a little bit greater purpose, so that they felt like their placement there was not a hint of what's to come, but maybe served a greater purpose in this particular story, or omit them entirely. Drop them in an end credit scene if you want to hint towards something that's coming in the future, but not necessarily something that this movie needed to be good. That being said, I don't think it ruined the movie for me at all. I'm
No.
looking at it from an enjoyability standpoint, because what is a movie made for if not for enjoyability? But
Right. Well,
but
and
there are going to be these little things that after the movie you can think, how could I have improved that? That is one way that I think it could have been improved.
Right. And so going back to that original discussion, and I agree with you. I don't think the Quintessons make or break this film in any sense of the word. I thought they were an interesting addition, but they didn't. They were a catalyst for um, Sentinel Prime's character more than anything else, and that was fine. That's all they needed to be. We didn't need a full-on war between the Transformers and the Quintessons at this point, and there was no reason for that. So
That
was
does happen.
fine.
That comes later.
Sure. In regards to Sentinel Prime, the from a storytelling perspective, one of the few things there's two things that I really appreciated that they did in this film. One of them was in regards to this, and it is that what we have been saying so far in this film is when you first watch it, you as the audience pretty easily take away that, oh, Sentinel Prime is probably a bad guy. And I don't think and I think that the creators of this film were aware of that. That it's a pretty cliche, stereotypical thing for the guy at the top to actually have been turncoat evil originally. And so the acknowledgement of that came pretty early on, and I think that that's a strong storytelling technique in that
just get
if
it out of the way.
You are going to do something stereotypical, you put the revelation early on so that you clean the slate, right? The expectations of the audience are then reset because what you expected was already revealed as if it wasn't a huge revelation.
Yeah,
and at that point,
you don't make it feel like it's going to be something that's building up to.
right.
But by that point, everybody's like, "Yeah, I've known for an hour." You're like,
Right,
"No,
exactly.
like this is something they don't know, but you know, you're supposed to know."
Right.
Unless you are one of the kids watching it, then maybe you were surprised, but that's okay.
What? Sentinel Prime is a bad guy. What? Yeah, no.
That probably happened in some theater somewhere in the world. I'm willing to bet.
What?
But
yeah,
again, I mean, like it served its purpose, and I agree. I felt like they made it so on the nose that it wasn't necessarily a disappointment.
No,
it wasn't like the finale that they were leading up to. They had a much greater finale in mind. This was simply something that they had to do and eventually reveal, but not at the end of the movie, partway through the movie, so that the real reveals can happen later on.
Right. And let me provide another example of this. Now, this film I'm about to tell you about is not a great film, but they
is
did
it Incredibles
do this one
2?
thing. No, it is not Incredibles 2.
Man, okay, I was going to say
Speed Racer.
Now, freaking love that movie.
If you've seen Speed Racer, CGI'd the crap out of everything. But in that film, they have this character. I can't even believe we're like saying this on the podcast. But
can we review Speed Racer next?
Speed Racer. This film, something else for reasons not going to be discussed here. Crazy, but in this film, they have this character named Racer X, right? And early on, you see that the main character, Speed, oh my goodness, his brother died in this crazy racing accident. This mysterious person who's always got his face covered, known as Racer X, has appeared out of nowhere, and he's a crazy good driver. You as the audience sit there and go, well, I wonder, is Racer X his long-lost brother that we thought died in a car crash? And what they did in this film is early on, they took that and they had the main character literally say that to Racer X and say, hey, I know you're my brother. You must be my brother. And then he takes off the mask. His face is completely different. And he goes, you're not my brother. And he says, no, I'm not. Right? And for you as the audience, you see that, and that revelation is revealed early on in the film, and you go, oh my goodness, well then who is he? Why is he doing this? What is this whole thing going on? Right? And it reset expectations early on in the film. Now, spoiler alert, that was a lie. They actually just had skin grafts in the guy's face, and that fixed everything, apparently, so whatever. But in that movie, they started off, and I recall distinctly watching that for the first time and going, okay, well, now where do we go with this? And that's the kind of thing you do if you have those revelations revealed very early on, if they are those stereotypical expectations.
I thought that was going to be a Speed Racer complaint, and I was going to have to step in and like defend it. So yeah, I'm glad we're aligned on that, because that movie is a national treasure.
Okay,
Deserves to be in
that is not
the
true.
archives. It deserves all of it.
No, that's probably the only time you'll hear me praise Speed Racer ever. So
on a Transformers podcast, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe somewhat appropriate that it came up here, but whatever. Anyways, that is one of two things that they did in this film that I was like, okay, I liked how they did that from a storytelling perspective. That's a good technique to use. That's enough time on that. We don't need to talk about that anymore.
Let's talk more about Speed Racer.
No. I think Sentinel Prime's character, other than that introduction of him in regards to him being beholden to the Quintessons and all of that, is pretty stock. He's pretty much the big bad guy. Oh, I'm here to make money and to stay in power, and everyone who's in the way deserves to die. And that's pretty much what you get for the rest of it.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
Dude, I'll take Lord Farquaad any day, dude.
That one's coming. I'm manifesting a Shrek podcast. I will be the one on it. It's in history now. It's happening.
Oh gosh, that's so funny. We'll see. If you want to see Shrek on this podcast, leave us a comment below.
Please, I beg of you. Look what I did for the game. A Lost Plot's most listened to podcast. We can make greatness again. Shrek.
Okay. We are moving on. So let's talk about, I think the rest of the film at this point is going to be hard to discuss without also discussing the development of D16, also known as Megatron, in this film. So I think it's appropriate to jump over to him before completing Orion Pax's arc into Optimus Prime. What are your thoughts on D16 as a character in this film?
So his descent into Megatron was almost entirely in parallel with Orion Pax's rise to Optimus Prime. And so it had a very satisfying like parallelism to it. Like it felt like it was like equal at every equal turn of the screw, that one became like one, the other one became like the other. And that all culminated there at the end of the movie. I don't want to like talk about that just yet, because I don't think we're there yet. But like throughout the movie, each one of those little clicks towards their relationship being strained and then broken and then like just straight up disfigured. It was like really heartbreaking to watch, because we've never gotten to see that story in actuality. It's always been in reference. And so D16 was a very compelling character. And frankly, at the end of this movie, one of the biggest reasons why I want a sequel, because I think that it was just so well done. It was unlike any kind of story that I've seen a villain become a villain, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like villains typically always have some element of villainy in them from the time that they're introduced. And so to see somebody who was aligned with one of pop culture's most notorious heroes, Optimus Prime, to see what was once a friend so close that they could be called brothers, go to somebody as treacherous and backstabbing as Megatron. It was a really, even though it was hard to watch, it was a very satisfying kind of story that they wove. And I felt like that was one of the biggest things that the movie had going for it, because of how well they told that story.
And I will say that they spent a lot of time on D16 and his development as a character, which I appreciated. I think
he deserved it. That's kind of what one of the things this story served to tell.
Right, especially because if you were to, if you were to ask me, I would say that the difference between Orion Pax and Optimus Prime is pretty much, here to here, versus the difference between D16 and Megatron is here to here, right? A huge change in regards to who they are as a character. And so I definitely think that his arc is a strong portion of this plot, and his interactions with Orion Pax as he goes through this and how they react to the situation differently, right? Orion Pax sees the result that, oh my goodness, Sentinel Prime is this character who has betrayed the original Primes and murdered all of them for the sake of gaining power. And the reaction of Orion Pax is one of, man, this sucks, we need to do something. And the reaction of D16, who turns into Megatron, is one of anger and betrayal and frustration. And he's very angry with Sentinel Prime and decides, I would kill this man if I could. That's what he says. And I thought that was good too, because it was a very organic, that sentence specifically was an organic demonstration of someone who's genuinely hurt, right? They say, what are you going to do? And he goes, I'm going to kill him, right? I am so angry right now. I feel so betrayed. And then he goes, but I can't do that, can I? Right? And he was just being, at that point, it wasn't him saying necessarily, I am actually going to kill this person. It was a desire to do that, but he didn't have the power to do that. And he was just venting that frustration. And then, which I also think is interesting, is that what was the other character's arc, or the other character in this whole discussion? Who was the old robot who was there?
Oh, Alpha Trion.
Alpha Trion. So Alpha Trion, because what was interesting to me was when he goes on this little rant and he goes, but I can't do that, right? Then Alpha Trion says, well, how about this? Let me give you the power. Now go and kick some butt. And that's what then compels them forward into the rest of the film, which I thought was interesting, that it was after that rant and after that desire. There was almost like a sense in which Alpha Trion also desired that same thing to some degree, although he was clearly not in the capacity to do it.
I think there's a lot of nuance there, and I think it's a lot to unpack. And you could interpret their motivations differently, which is why I completely respect yours. But I disagree in the sense that I do think that going back to Alpha Trion, but before we get like too far away from it, I do want to address. I think that Orion Pax and Optimus are a lot more differentiated than you give it credit for. I think if I had to guess where you're getting this from, is that Megatron, D16 to Megatron, is just more palpable. The difference from going to a friendly to an evil person is just a way bigger contrast from going to a friendly person to somebody who learns how to be a leader, from somebody who's never had any kind of power. And so it's not that there's not a difference in the character that they become. It's that Megatron is just so like overbearing. His change is so massive that it can overshadow Orion Pax to Optimus. Mm-hmm. But I do still believe that fundamentally they are different characters at the beginning of the film from the end of the film. And at the end of the movie, there's that little flashback to when they first met in their barracks, and they became friends for the first time. And that to me was highlighting, like, look at how far we've come, or for some of us, look at how far we've fallen. And I mean, that was the whole reason for the pep talk scene. We still haven't talked about Alita-1 or Bumblebee. I don't think we've mentioned their names once, so that kind of says something. But like that was the whole purpose of that pep talk scene, where he's just like dejected. Orion Pax. He's gotten his cog. He's tried to like keep D16 from going off the deep end, and he basically just gets KO'd, and he feels like he's failed his friend, which he cares a lot about. And that's when Alita's like, hey, you're a leader. You've exhibited all of these qualities, and that she didn't see in him before. That's why she felt she kind of just had disrespect and disdain, and just kind of like you guys are crazy. You're unhinged, and I don't want anything to do with you. But by that point in the movie, she saw what Orion Pax had become, like what he had exhibited. He had exhibited the strength of a leader that had gotten them to that point. And that kind of leadership got them a lot farther by the end of the movie as well. And so, going back to Alpha Trion, that is a definitely like interesting point that you make. I hadn't really thought about how like how Alpha Trion's motive could have aligned more closely to D16 than Orion Pax. I would have to think about that for a little bit, because I kind of took it as initially, I'm going to give you the power to change your world. Do it wisely.
Mm-hmm.
Not that he was necessarily going out and saying like, do violence, right? But he also like shooed them all off and was like, this one's mine, right? Like, so
Right.
like he kind of had like a little bit of an edge to him. And I think that there's a lot of like degrees, right? It's not to say that like Alpha Trion is just like Orion Pax or just like D16. He kind of seemed to straddle the fence in between both. Like he's a warrior. He's got experience being a leader. He's got experience in the field of battle, and he feels like there's been an injustice, that all of his brethren have been killed at the hands of this guy who he finds out is still alive, and maybe he wants that revenge.
Right.
But Orion Pax is better than that. I mean, which kind of is a testament to his character and his character arc, that in contrast to this guy who is a Prime, was one of the first Cybertronians to ever be created, you got Orion Pax here, who literally just got his TCOG and is already exhibiting the heart of somebody greater than what many Cybertronians would consider their heroes. And there's a reason that he's chosen to be the new and now only Prime. And it's because he's got that heart, and he's got a good moral compass, and he's a good role model, and he's willing to lead people where otherwise they don't know what to do or where to go or what to think. And he points them in that right direction. So all of that to say, I think it's a testament to the progression of a character that they gave Orion Pax. And I'm just now like thinking through all of this, because this wasn't evident to me in the theater, which is part of what's fun about podcasts like this, is it gives you an opportunity to think things through on the fly too, and maybe come up with some conclusions that you didn't get upon your first watch. But I think it's really cool that they contrasted a young Orion Pax to somebody with the like elite status as Alpha Trion, and showing people that like even Alpha Trion might have been wrong, and that Orion Pax has the making to be even better than any of the other Primes ever were.
Yeah, like
rant over.
No, I think you've made a somewhat compelling point, especially in regards to the Alita-1 discussion with Orion Pax about what it means to be a leader and that whole interaction, and just seeing that play out. I could see that being a guiding light. I wish they would have seen more failure in regards to leadership to show that full growth. But that could be more of a personal preference. It doesn't mean that the arc isn't there. It just is less prevalent, especially in comparison to.
It was more of like a I feel like I failed, and she's like, no, you didn't fail. Whereas like you were basically wanting to see more legitimate failure, more than just like a pity party kind of like, oh, I failed. No, you didn't. Like, is that what you want? You were basically saying you want to see like a legitimate shortcoming?
Sure, I think that most, the generic growth arc that you generally see is one where growth is found through suffering, right? And so how did he truly suffer? If it's purely emotional, then show that. But I think that the emotional aspect was only shown in that time where he's sitting throwing a pity party versus when he actually goes out into battle, which most of this is an action film. And so there's a lot less emphasis, at least in Orion Pax's case, to deal with the psychological impact of not being a good leader, right? Until that single point in the film.
Well, they had that message they were supposed to bring back to show everybody in Iacon. That had, with all the sand in it, that had gotten broken. So he felt like he failed in that regard. He just watched his friend go off the deep end when he tried to talk him down. So he felt like he failed in that regard. So it's not that he hadn't failed. It's that maybe his reaction of getting dejected was a little disproportionate to, like, I don't know. I mean, I can't say I might not have felt the same in that scenario, which is, I guess, one way to evaluate the legitimacy of what seems like a failure is like, how would you have felt? But at the same time, I don't know. It's how they wanted to tell the story, for better or for worse.
Right. Yeah, and I think that that's maybe more of my metric is based off of what we know on Orion Pax. Does it make sense that he would be this dejected about the situation? And that's more of probably one of my critiques of the film than anything else, is that they have some of these reactions that are more extreme than I think are justified based off of what we know in regards to them or their relationship to the situation at hand. So that's all I have to say on specifically Optimus Prime / Orion Pax's arc, but you have definitely garnered at some points in regards to that. I think that that's well worth mentioning.
So now it's going to be going from like a 4 something to now it's like a 5 something.
That's a big jump. That's a big. I don't know if you can
Is it
claim
though?
that much. In regards to the final climax of the film, you have D16 come in to face down Sentinel Prime and take him out with his massive gun, and Sentinel Prime gets damaged enough that he can't really run away, and that is when Orion Pax gets in the way and tells him, "Hey, we can't kill this guy. That's not right." And that is where you have D16 so angry that he's going to do it anyways and accidentally shoots Orion Pax in the process, and then proceeds to let him fall to his doom. In regards to that revelation in this film, what are your thoughts?
That was the defining moment of the entire movie for me. Because up until then, we had just been seeing D16 slipping.
Mm-hmm.
But when his eyes changed, that was like one of the coolest and saddest moments of the entire movie to me. That felt like that was the real climax of the movie to me.
For sure.
Because it wasn't finding out that Sentinel, like going back to what you were saying, like that was like the red herring thing. We all know, most people who watch this movie know, that Megatron wasn't always Megatron.
Mm-hmm.
But, so like a lot of us knew that this was coming. But how exactly they were going to get to that point, how exactly they were going to reveal that, that was still kind of up in the air. So I thought that was handled masterfully. I loved that. And the last thing I expected to come out of his mouth, maybe it was because out of an anticipation of doing something that was cliche, was to say something like, "I don't want to play with you anymore," or whatever. Like, I mean,
okay.
like, maybe that was more of like a Toy Story, but like to say like, "I'm done saving you," that was like, whoa, that was a really heavy moment, especially for a movie that literally has a PG rating. Like that one line carried weight, and you could see the emotion in his face. And at that same time that D16 became Megatron, him dropping Orion Pax like that is ultimately what led to him becoming Optimus Prime. So
Right.
that was like in that same moment, that was both of their final forms being taken. And
Right.
I thought it was easily the most powerful moment of the entire movie.
For sure, yeah. And I would definitely say that the whole message that you get from what Orion Pax does there is great, especially now that in my mind it does connect to the leadership arc, because you're talking about what does leadership look like, right? At the end of the day, leadership is about sacrifice, right?
He was standing up for
willing to
somebody
do?
that he believed should be punished, but not like that.
Right. And it's about doing the right thing no matter what, and facing the consequences of that, even if it's protecting the people that you despise from the people that you truly care about.
It's two very different ideas of justice.
Right.
D16 Megatron ultimately believed that justice was execution of those who would do wrong. And Orion Pax has a more graceful approach where he feels that justice has to be dealt with a lighter hand.
Mm-hmm.
And that you can't just go around killing anybody just because you disagree with them, just because they've done something wrong. That's not an automatic death sentence. And there are right ways and wrong ways to go about issuing justice. And ultimately, that was irreconcilable between the two of them. And that's kind of what led that division just to grow and grow.
I was genuinely surprised about how Megatron drops Orion Pax into the abyss and betrays him like that. Right, I expected some level of a division or a rift between them in this film. I was not expecting that specifically, so I thought they did that well. I do somewhat take beef with how the arc develops with D16, because frankly, I don't. D16 is an interesting character, right? They start him off being this somewhat timid, reserved character who doesn't want to go beyond protocol, right? And he wants to simply do his job and rise in the ranks. And his friend, who's always trying to get him into trouble to do the things he doesn't want to do because it's fun or it might lead to something great, is causing all these problems in his life, right? Then he gets the revelation that the entire life he's been living has been a lie. And that really breaks him to some degree, where he's just very angry and vengeful. But then at the same time, he suddenly takes on these qualities of leadership in a way that I thought was a little maybe extreme. It was justifiable underneath the Starscream paradigm, which I did like seeing Starscream. But the whole idea of taking on the resistance cause, right, that exists in this counter movement to Sentinel Prime was interesting, because it's a might makes right, whoever is strongest is the leader scenario. And it turns out that D16 is the strongest, so he leads. I didn't have a problem with that specifically, but he wasn't it still didn't make him necessarily the great leader that you see by the end of the film, first off. But that's not my big problem. My problem is that he is angry with Sentinel Prime. He's not angry with Orion Pax. He's maybe frustrated with Orion Pax and
that he keeps getting in his way, and trying to thwart him.
But it's not like a vengeful anger. And so when he comes to the situation where he's about to kill Sentinel Prime, and then Orion Pax gets in the way, he's very much like, I'm not going to kill you. I'm here to kill him. Get out of my way, because you are becoming a problem now. Right? That is.
It was entirely an accident.
Right? Yeah, 100%. And so that, combined with me not really seeing where he saved him in the past, made the very end where he lets him go feel a little disjointed.
So they do imply that, like, from the very beginning, when Orion Pax is getting in his antics, and then D16 protects him from some of those guards that chased him all the way out of the archives and down into the main streets. They implied that it's like, oh man, you saved me again, right? Like, they've got this relationship where Orion Pax is constantly getting himself into trouble and D16 is constantly bailing him out. So just because they didn't show it like a handful of times throughout the movie, they had kind of established that that is just an element of their relationship, both on screen and off screen.
Sure. I think so. Like, as an
it's totally fine to wish they had showcased it more. But at the very least, they established that that's something that has happened, does happen, and would have continued to happen until he just decided he's like, not anymore. You're too much of a liability to my cause.
Right. I think I get what you're saying, right? And I had thought of that when I initially thought of this issue. While it is a mild example of him, like, saving him from the enemy of Starwing or whoever that was trying Darkwing in the mines as they're mining, while it indicated it for something as significant as what you just saw, the betrayal, him saying, I'm done saving you, I think should have had some more significant example of the brotherly bond that he was breaking in that moment to really have it make sense. So even when they were escaping the cave and fighting those robots, if Megatron was the one who saved him from a last ditch death that could have occurred in that moment, I think there was plenty of opportunities where they could have shown a very significant scenario where everything was lost, and then Megatron D16 comes in and saves the day. And he has been this hero for Orion Pax throughout his history, right? And in the most dire of situations. So I don't know. I think I personally felt like especially the dialogue there was unconvincing, as epic as it was supposed to sound. Personally.
Okay, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that you're looking at a perfect moment and trying to find something wrong with it. I'm just joking. No, I can see what you're saying. Even just like one and I could be forgetting it, but I don't suspect we're both forgetting it. Even just like one more instance when they were maybe fighting the Elite Guard or whatever Starscream and Soundwave and Shockwave all called themselves, and the Seekers and all of that. If D16 had saved Orion Pax just one more time, maybe that would have hit that home a little bit more. For me, that I didn't get hung up on that because I read between the lines and connected like what they did give us. But if you could have made it more powerful, that's something else. So yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean that's. I'm not going to dwell too much more on that. I think I've said my piece. But I still thought that that actually occurring, I was genuinely surprised. I wasn't expecting them to actually have Orion Pax fall to his death, and then the Earth swallows him up and spits him back out as the Angel of Light.
So what that whole scene depicted was
Death and resurrection.
He fell to no, I mean like he fell to
yes, it does.
he fell into the heart of Primus himself. They established at the very beginning, our creator turned into our planet. His spark still lives at the center of the planet. He went and like was addressed. He was received by Primus himself, who all this time had been the one that had received the Matrix of Leadership ever since the Primes lost it and Sentinel Prime tried to steal it. When that disappeared, it went to go be at the core of the planet. And Primus himself sensed the worthiness of Orion Pax and rebranded him to sell new toys.
From Hasbro.
No, this isn't Orion Pax. This is Optimus Prime. Nice. It's $20 more. That's how you can tell. And at that point, he was bestowed the Matrix of Leadership, and he got patched up, and he got sent back up to go finish the job. And by that point, up till that point in the movie, he had all of the character growth. He had all of the leadership qualities that had been fostered and developed from the very beginning of the movie to that point. It wasn't the physical transformation that made him Optimus Prime. It was the personal growth that had made him. Now he just happens to be bigger, faster, stronger, all of that jazz.
Nice.
Pun intended.
Yes.
It's one of those instances where it's like it's not the physical strength of the character. It's the character of the character. The physical strength just makes him that much more of a threat. And so, like, to be able to contend with an equally big threat like Megatron. Like, they had very distinct like upgrade cycles. It's like they got their T-Cogs and they went from being little to big, but then D16 and Orion Pax specifically went through this process of like getting even bigger. Like for Megatron, it was getting the what did you say? This isn't normally referenced in the Transformers lore, so to me it's not as deeply ingrained. But who was the Prime? The
Megatron is Prime.
Megatron is Prime. And so, that's where he's
that and you not.
Well, that like I said, it's not
a bigger fan than you.
I'm pretty sure that's either like a relatively new thing in Transformers lore, or if it was just made for this movie. I don't know, but that was that like taking
that's
out
not
his
canon.
Taking out no, it is now. Taking out his T-Cog that Alpha Trion gave him from some other Prime, and then putting in Megatronus Prime's T-Cog is what gave him his last like juice up. And then for Optimus, it was the Matrix of Leadership. And so that kind of, I liked that just like explained in universe why they're so much bigger than the rest of the people on their teams, in contrast to Starscream and Soundwave for Megatron, and in contrast to like Bumblebee and like literally almost all of them for Optimus. And so they did kind of give some little like in-world explanation. I like the subtleties that this movie is able to provide, little things like that. So I feel like there's a lot of nuance that we haven't talked about so far. Like we've barely talked about some of like the supporting characters.
Yeah. And I think it would be appropriate to talk about Alita-1 and then Bumblebee at this point. and then any other characters you feel are worth mentioning. But
Yeah,
let's start off with Alita.
Anyway, next. No, I'll just say it. As somebody who's been touting a lot of like enjoyability out of this movie, they were some of the weakest elements for me. I'll say that. I'll get it out there so that you don't have to be like, I really expect Nick to like really just like glorify this. It wasn't. It was not the best part. I'm not saying that it was all bad. I'm saying that it was largely not good. But what did you think of it? Because I'm sure that whatever I think, you'll probably think worse.
I mean, Alita-1 was decent enough, right? I thought she was mildly annoying as a character, but she served her purpose as well, and honestly, she has a decent enough arc of she hates them, and then she tolerates them, and then she goes, you know what, they're actually half decent. I'm happy to be a part of this crew, right?
Reluctantly.
Whatever.
Under duress of going to space.
Exactly. Bumblebee, personally, I thought was annoying AF.
Irredeemable.
I'm sorry.
And I say that as a Bumblebee fan. I almost every iteration of Bumblebee, big fan. I actually have like a little Bumblebee like Easter egg like right there.
Nice.
And so, gosh, Keegan was not the right pick to voice Bumblebee. I knew it from the beginning. I knew it from the time that I saw the casting. I'm like him a lot, not as Bumblebee.
Yeah, exactly. No, Keegan-Michael Key. I'm sorry. No,
I will say the couple good jokes in there that did land for me. Like at the end, he's like, "I get to work for the government."
That's true.
And then the reference to Aatron,
I did see that.
Aaron substitute teacher, Key and Peele skit, great jokes. Yep. But those are like the 1% of the things that came out of his mouth. All the rest was just too over the top for me. Wasn't my kind of humor. Some of the jokes might have even landed if it just wasn't him delivering them. So like, I don't want to sound like a hater because I do tend to like him in a lot of the stuff that he's in, but there is such a thing as bad casting, and there's just nothing about Bumblebee that comes with Keegan.
Yeah, and frankly, especially considering as much as the Michael Bay films are not great, right? They do a lot at trying to develop Bumblebee's character as a Transformer in those. And, love it or hate it, I felt like they tried at least to do him justice versus this. He's just the butt end of jokes, and that's the whole point of him existing in this film. Love it.
Yeah. Any like Transformers media where Bumblebee lost his voice is typically depicted as having been done because of some kind of traumatic injury.
Right.
In the Bumblebee movie, it was because I think it was Thundercracker or somebody might have like literally like pulled out his voice box. In Transformers Prime, the TV show, great TV show. It's kind of like my favorite Transformers like iteration in anything. I'm trying to remember how they explained that. I don't know if they actually. No, they did show it. I think it was actually Megatron in that capacity that took his voice. And in this, I just kept wishing for the first time that somebody would take his voice. I'm like, please just give me the beeps. I don't know. I feel like it didn't feel like Bumblebee. Like it didn't feel like he had any kind of meaningful improvement or contribution to the movie other than just being the humor element.
Right.
And when it's not even necessarily all good humor, it kind of just makes you have a little bit of disdain for a character because you're like, you could be so much better. You could be so much more for this story. And it's like, it's not like you got a huge ensemble, right? Like there's 4 primary characters. So like any one of those 4 that are not solid are going to drag the movie down. And there's a reason that for like an hour or so, I'm not looking at the clock, an hour plus, we hadn't even addressed Bumblebee and Alita. And I feel like we cannot be the only people who felt that way.
No, not at all.
I agree.
What are your thoughts on this film as a whole and the lasting impact of it? I mean, we're looking at the film that has just released. Do we think it has a lot that has come after? And is it the question is there going to be more that comes beyond this film, or is this the start and end of a reboot?
I will say, for all of its shortcomings, I do hope that there are more, because are they going to recast any of the voice actors? I doubt it. But there's enough here to be able to still pull through a good story, a good overarching trilogy story. And maybe the writing gets better. Maybe the voice acting is like toned down a little bit so that characters like Bumblebee aren't necessarily so annoying.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that it's like so far gone, just scrap it. I think that this was, despite its shortcomings, one of like I'm just gonna say it's the best Transformers movie to come out. Really, the only one of any like actual comparability and greatness is going all the way back to like the '86,
Wow.
like Transformers the movie, which you had to have watched like 2 or 3 seasons of the Transformers G1 TV show to be able to like have the context to watch. And so I think that really it only has itself to be compared to. And that's why a podcast like this needed to happen, is because you need to be able to evaluate it. And when you don't have like a yardstick in like the Transformers movie camp, you have other medias. There's always like some new reimagining of it that came out. But this was something like that desperately needed to be done. Whether or not it was perfect, it was good enough that I'm glad that it exists. Because I was saying back like in the when did the first Transformers movie, 2007, is that when it came out? Something around there.
Yeah.
For the longest time I've been saying like, give us a story that's all the Transformers. Don't consume half the runtime or more with people that we just do not care about, just to advance the story, just to cut down on the CGI costs.
This don't like Shia LaBeouf?
Do it. Just do it. And so I've been saying this for forever, and they finally did it. And I think this is a good capacity to do it. It didn't have to be inaccessible to children. That's too big of an audience. Frankly, I mean, like Transformers has always existed to sell toys. So the fact that we're able to get any good storytelling out of it is a great thing. But I'm happy with what we got. Maybe not ecstatic, but very happy with it. With hopes that looking to the future, we can get even better with the following movie. Now I know it's a high bar, because typically sequels are not often as good as the initial ones.
Right.
But it's also not impossible to do either. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of like little miscellaneous things that I wanted to say. Like I love the references. Like there's some point that Alita-1 was like I think it was when they were first down in the mines, she's criticizing Orion Pax. She's like, you don't have the touch or the power. There's a song that's like the most 80s song you'll ever hear. It's by Stan Bush, called The Touch, and it plays in Transformers the movie. And that was like nobody says anything that inorganic without it being a reference. So like I understood the reference. There was like some reference that she made to GoBots, which like just Google GoBots, like that has their own like history outside of the Transformers world, like in our world that has. So that was kind of fun. Character design, I have some mixed reviews on. Overall, I really liked it. It was their faces that stood out to me. They were almost like plasticky in comparison to the rest of their mechanical bodies. And I know that it was so that they can convey more human emotion, because there was a lot of emotion in that movie. But I just wish they could have made it maybe a little bit more angular so that it didn't stand out in contrast to the rest of their bodies so much. That being said, Arachnid, or Arachnid, that was an interesting play on words. She had the coolest design. Really liked that. More of that, please. Like I liked all of their Cybertronian alt modes, but hers was one of my favorite. Her eyes, her overall just character. I frankly hope that she gets more time in future movies. I liked that the Quintessons had more of like a techno-organic kind of design. Like their ship kind of looked like it had the same texture as like a crab carapace to it. That normally is not. They're typically depicted as more like on the robotic side, maybe not as angular and robotic as the Transformers, but not quite like that. I thought that was an interesting take. And if that does come up down the road in future movies, that'll kind of serve as like a nice visual contrast to the more metal, construct of how they designed the Transformers.
Right.
A lot of great,
Well, more importantly, the Quintessons will be able to sell a lot of merch.
Yes, Quintesson
Hasbro.
merch. I'm not going to be buying any of that. I liked the choreography. That was great. Like the last 30 minutes of the movie were my favorite 30 minutes of the movie because you got like a lot of the fighting was pretty sweet. I mean, like the jump pose that Optimus made, which was like slow motion for like 1 second. That whole pose, that's a total G1 callback. So that was another reference. There's this moment where he like flipped his little like thrusters that are normally like on his shoulder pads around, and he like jetted off of like a rock. That was a G1 reference. There's so much service for the fans that I appreciated, and I think that probably helped make up for a lot of the shortcomings of the movie, where somebody who maybe is not as big of a fan, that's not going to mean as much to them, if anything, and that's not necessarily going to be like a tick in the plus column.
Right.
Yeah, that's a lot. I have a lot to say. I thought it was a very enjoyable movie. As somebody who doesn't go out to the movies nearly as much anymore, that was one that I can't say I regretted.
Nice, and that's good. Yeah, I wouldn't say I regretted watching it either. I don't know if it's necessarily in my rewatchability matrix, but it definitely was a enjoyable watch for sure. There's definitely potential, as we discussed early on, for sequels in this film. As of now, and this is coming, the tail end of the weekend that it came out, right? We're looking at it making, what is it, like 40 million out of the total cost of 30 to 40 million, with the total cost of its production being 75 to 147 million, including the production release. So will we see a sequel? We'll see. If the money becomes the defining factor,
honestly, they're gonna make back multitudes in merch. I'm just telling you. I mean,
that's on Hasbro.
Look at me. I mean, one. I just helped fund the second movie, so.
So we'll see. Will we get the sequels like we do in other films that have tried to jump off the wagon after the first one, right? Are we going to get the sequels just like we got with the Batman trilogy with Christopher Nolan, or are we going to get Avatar: The Last Airbender, where the first one came out and nothing happened after that?
Don't even speak that into existence.
We'll have to see, so stay tuned. But as for now, that's all we got for today. We will see you back, as we always are, next week.
We will see you back next time with Shrek.
Not Shrek next week, no. We might see Shrek at some point, but not next week. We will see another in the DC universe next week. And we'll see you all then.